Chapter 1. A visitor in the fog. It was in the waning days of October, when a damp chill had settled over London, that I found myself once more at Baker Street, drawn as so often by a combination of friendship, curiosity, and the peculiar magnetism of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The fog that evening was of that thick, creamy character which clings to one's overcoat and seems to muffle the very sound of the city. The gas lamps burned as small, dim halos in the gray, while hansom cabs emerged like phantoms and vanished again without a trace. It was the sort of night that Londoners know well, oppressive, mysterious, and brimming with unspoken possibilities. Holmes was in his armchair, a Turkish slipper of tobacco at his side, his long, nervous fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin. His eyes, which could blaze with a hawk-like intensity, were at that moment half closed as he listened to the low crackle of the fire. Upon the table lay the scattered detritus of his restless mind, chemical reagents, scraps of newsprint, and a curious length of silken cord, coiled like a sleeping snake. "Ah, Watson," he said, without lifting his gaze, "you have returned from Kensington by way of Marylebone Road, having stopped briefly to purchase cigars at your club, and judging by the damp on your right boot stepped inadvertently into a puddle as you hailed your cab." I laughed. "You make it sound as though you have followed me every step of the way." "On the contrary," he replied, opening his eyes now, "I merely followed the facts. The faint odor of those cheap Turkish cigars you are so fond of lingers upon your coat. Your gloves are dusted with the reddish grit peculiar to Marylebone Road. And as for your boot," he gestured lazily, "elementary." It was at that moment, as the clock on the mantel struck 8:30, that Mrs. Hudson entered, her face unusually grave. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "He seems in quite a state, sir." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson. Watson, I believe we are to be entertained." A moment later, our visitor was ushered in. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, tall and gaunt, with a face drawn as if by worry into sharp lines. His coat was respectable, but bore the signs of hurried travel. His hat, still damp from the fog, trembled faintly in his hand. His eyes, pale gray and wide, darted about the room before settling upon Holmes with something like desperate hope. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he began in a voice strained yet cultured. "Thank God. My name is Henry Willoughby. I have come to you in the gravest distress." "Pray, take a seat, Mr. Willoughby," Holmes said, motioning to the chair opposite. "And if you will allow me to observe, you have come directly from Waterloo Station, and not without incident." The man blinked in astonishment. "I did indeed arrive by the South Western Railway not half an hour ago. But how?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "The ticket stub protruding from your pocket is marked Waterloo, 3rd class. The smear of coal dust upon your right cuff suggests you brushed against the ironwork of the station stairs, and the torn stitching at your left elbow well, that bespeaks either a scuffle or a rather unlucky encounter with a railway turnstile." Mr. Willoughby managed a weak smile. "You are everything they say, Mr. Holmes." Holmes waved the compliment aside with characteristic impatience. "Let us come to the matter at hand. You spoke of distress?" "Yes," Willoughby said, leaning forward. "A dreadful occurrence has taken place. My ward, Miss Eleanor Marcia, young lady, of only 19, was found this morning unconscious in her chambers at our estate near Guildford. She has not spoken a word since, and the cause, sir, defies reason. Holmes repeated softly, his eyes sharpening. Willoughby swallowed. "Near her bed, upon the floor, was a serpent, but not like any serpent I have ever seen. It was pale, almost opalescent, and dead. There was no sign of how it had entered the room. No mark upon her save a faint bruise upon the wrist, and yet the village physician insists she was struck down by some manner of venom. He can neither identify the creature nor explain its presence." Holmes' gaze drifted to the window, where the fog pressed like a living thing against the glass. "A serpent of opal hue," he murmured. "Curious indeed. And you say she remains insensible?" "Entirely. She breathes. Her pulse is weak but steady. She seems locked within some dreadful sleep." Holmes rose now, tall and thin as a rapier. "And the serpent, where is it now?" "At my house," said Willoughby. "I brought the body with me, in a secured crate. It waits at the station." "Excellent," Holmes said crisply. "Watson, you will accompany me to Guildford in the morning. Mr. Willoughby, there is more to this than mere exotic fauna. Of that I am certain." Willoughby's composure faltered. More, he said in a hushed tone. 3 nights before this occurred, my butler found a scrap of parchment placed at our gate. Upon it, in a rough hand, was scrawled a warning. The Opal Serpent strikes at the innocent. We took it for a prank. A warning ignored, Holmes said gravely. And was there any sign of intrusion? Footprints, disturbed earth, a ladder by the window? None, Willoughby insisted. The room was locked from the inside, the windows latched. No one could have entered without being seen. Holmes turned to me with a glint in his eye that I had come to recognize over the years. The unmistakable spark of a mind roused to battle. Watson, he said, this promises to be most instructive. We spent the next hour eliciting further details from Mr. Willoughby. He was, it seemed, the legal guardian of Miss Marsh, an orphan of considerable inheritance. Their estate, Greyhaven Hall, was an old but well-kept property on the outskirts of Guildford. The household consisted of Willoughby himself, Miss Marsh, a butler named Hargreaves, a housekeeper, and a small staff of servants. There had been no visitors of note in the past fortnight. When at last he departed, declining our offer of tea in his agitation, Holmes stood for a long while in the silent room, hands clasped behind his back, pacing as the clock ticked steadily. The firelight caught his profile keen, hawk-like, relentless. A serpent of no known species, he mused. A locked room, a cryptic warning, and a young heiress rendered speechless. Watson, do you not find the combination most stimulating? I do indeed, I replied, though I confess a chill passed through me. There was something in Mr. Willoughby's manner, something unspoken that I could not quite place. Holmes abruptly rang the bell. Mrs. Hudson, fetch our traveling valises. We depart at dawn. Then, to me, in that cool tone that brooked no argument, rest well, my dear Watson. Tomorrow we will go serpent hunting. Chapter the 2nd. The locked chamber at Greyhaven Hall. We quitted Baker Street at an hour when the lamps of London still burned like wan stars through a sodden veil. The fog had thinned to a yellowish gauze by the time our hansom set us down at Waterloo, yet the station roof collected it as a net might gather minnows, and the great concourse swam in a damp and spectral gloom. Holmes moved through it with his usual sinuous certainty, as if the crowds parted by some unspoken arrangement. Mr. Henry Willoughby, already pallid from a sleepless night, waved at us anxiously from the shadow of a pillar. The crate, he whispered, and glanced about as though fearful of eavesdroppers, has been held in the parcels office, as you instructed by telegram, Mr. Holmes. I could not bear to have it sent on blindly. Quite right, said Holmes with a dry nod. Lead on. We passed beneath a soot-blackened arch, where an underclerk produced a ledger with the defeated air of a man accustomed to inscrutable requests. The object of our errand stood upon a trestle, a stout wooden box of modest proportions, its lid secured by 2 screws and a padlock. A chalk scrawl on the side read W/Greyhaven Urgent. The wood smelled faintly of salt and oil, as if it had in some previous existence known the hold of a ship. Holmes knelt and examined the seams with a small lens, which he drew, like a conjurer's wand, from the inner pocket of his coat. Sawdust fir, not oak, he murmured, and mixed with a granulated powder. You observe this, Watson? I bent closer. In the interstices lay a dust of the palest gray, nearly white, that clung to the fingertip like talc. It is not flour, said I, nor plaster, nor chalk, Holmes added, and without further speech loosened the screws with a pocket screwdriver, produced a tiny key from his watch chain, and sprang the padlock. Willoughby flinched as the lid came free. Within, upon a lining of coarse sacking, lay the serpent. It was indeed of an uncanny pallor, not wholly white but suffused with that milky iridescence one sees in certain opals, or in the belly of a fish newly drawn from the sea. Its length would have been 3 feet at the most, and its head somewhat wedge-shaped bore small scales that caught the weak light and scattered it in the faintest hues of green and violet. The mouth gaped a little, revealing tiny curved fangs. There was no odor of decay. Holmes did not touch it at first. He peered, he circled, he inhaled lightly. Camphor, he said, and something else, benzoate perhaps. It has been preserved, but not by a taxidermist. The belly showed a narrow seam, paler than the rest, as if the scales lay there with a more regular patience. A cut? I ventured. A closure, he answered, later. He took a pair of fine forceps from his case and lifted the head with a delicacy almost tender. Note the fangs, perfectly real, perfectly functional. The venom Saka. There is our friend Camphor again. Someone has meddled with Death's own file. Willoughby shuddered. You think it is a plaything? I think nothing, Holmes replied, until I have more data. Replace the lid. We shall have it sent on to Greyhaven, under our care. It was characteristic of my friend that even at such a moment, with a mystery coiled at our feet, his mind found pastime in the apparently trivial. As we made our way to the platform, a porter, whose cap sat askew upon his thatch of hair, went by at a trot, muttering. Holmes turned, looked once at the man's boots, and called after him. You will find your missing watch in the dog-cart, he said. The porter stopped dead. Lor, sir, left-hand seat, under the blanket. You thrust it there in the rain and forgot. The key is with Mrs. Dodd, who disapproves of late wages, and keeps them in her apron till Sunday. The man's astonishment widened to a grin. That's gospel, sir. But how? Holmes touched the brim of his hat and moved on, his lips twitching. To my curious glance, he remarked, his boots show the round pressure of a watch case against the inner ankle. He carried it in the top of his sock earlier this morning. The strap mark upon his wrist is fresh, yet he wears no watch now. The dog-cart splash upon his trousers tells the vehicle. The horsehair upon his cuff gives me the blanket. As for Mrs. Dodd, the soap flakes upon his sleeve are scented with violet, a smell I have met only in the cheaper brand of a certain Lambeth shop, where the forewoman is a Mrs. Dodd, a terror with the petty cash. Ingenious, I said, not without admiration. Elementary, he corrected, and then, softening, added, but the Serpent is not. Our train slid out, and London unrolled its dreary fringe of sooty yards and chimney-pots before yielding to the tired fields of Surrey. Willoughby sat opposite us, his long hands nervously pleating a glove. At intervals he would look from the window to Holmes' impassive profile, as a drowning man may measure the distance of a lifebuoy. Tell me, Mr. Willoughby, said Holmes at last, this Greyhaven Hall old, modernized? Damp? It is of the late Georgian period, sir, returned our client. Whitewashed brick, with a shallow pediment. The rooms are generous. Miss Marsh occupies the east chamber on the upper floor, which overlooks the lawn. There is a smaller dressing room within. The house is dry, though, in this climate. Who can say? He attempted a mirthless smile. We have had no complaints of miasmas, if that is your concern. Everything is my concern, Holmes replied. The servants? There is Hargreaves, my butler of 15 years, Mrs. Dorrit, the housekeeper, a cook, and 2 maids, a groom, Carter, and a gardener who comes by the day. No lady's companion for Miss Marsh? She had a governess, Miss Finch, dismissed 6 months ago, when Eleanor came of age. Since then, Willoughby faltered, since then she has preferred her books and the piano. Holmes' eyes half closed. And her inheritance? Willoughby's mouth tightened. I suppose the lawyers would say considerably. We arrived at Guildford near noon. The sky, which had promised a watery sun, offered instead a glare like tarnished pewter. A closed carriage awaited us, bearing on its door the faded device of a grey hawk. Willoughby ushered us in with a politeness that could not mask his agitation. We drove through lanes rimmed with hedges beaded and damp, past fields where crows lifted and settled like scraps of old cloth, until Greyhaven Hall came into view. A long, pale facade with tall windows, and a modest portico, set upon a rise where the lawn sloped away to a fringe of beech. If the house seemed calm to the eye, the air about it vibrated with suppressed anxiety. A servant hurried to take our coats. Faces hovered at doorways like anxious moons. The butler, Hargreaves, an upright man with iron gray hair and a face as fixed as an altar pest, came forward. Mr. Willoughby, sir, Mr. Holmes. We are grateful that you have come. Holmes' bow was barely perceptible. We will be shown at once to Miss Marsh's chamber. Hargreaves exchanged a glance with his master. Dr. Remley left at 11, sir, with the promise to return at 5. Miss Marsh still sleeps. Very good, said Holmes. The room. We ascended the staircase, which was wide and shallow, carpeted in a faded crimson. At the landing, a tall window admitted a gray light in which dust motes turned like hesitant snow. The east corridor smelled faintly of beeswax, and my medical nose caught it carbolic. We paused before a white door whose brass knob had been tied with a length of blue ribbon. At your instructions, sir, Hargreaves murmured to Willoughby. We have shut the room since morning, except for the doctor's visit. Nothing has been touched. Lock it, Holmes said, and stand aside. We entered upon a chamber of soothing proportions, Pale walls, a fireplace with a simple mantel, a four-post bed draped in muslin. A dressing table stood near the window, its oval mirror turned slightly askew, as though it had lately reflected a hasty hand. There was a faint, sweet odor in the air, something floral, cloying, not of the house itself. Holmes crossed the threshold without sound, his gaze raking the place in a single sweep that encompassed ceiling, hearth, bed, and the small inner door to the dressing room. I went first to the bed, where Miss Eleanor Marsh lay propped upon pillows, her face in repose so complete as to be almost statuesque. She was a fair young woman, with a purity of feature marred only by the least tinge of blue at the lips. At the left wrist bloomed a faint ovoid bruise, scarcely darker than the skin about it. Her breathing was even but shallow. I took her pulse low, regular, and lifted an eyelid. The pupil's response was languid. There was no sign of fever. The skin was cool. I asked after her urine, her bowels, the possible administration of laudanum. Hargreaves reported none. A trance, I said in a low voice. Induced, but by what? Holmes, who had been tracing the skirting board with his stick, crouched at the hearth. Watson, your attention to the living is as humane as ever. Mine must make do with the inanimate. He indicated the fender with a nod. You perceive nothing unusual? I joined him. The grate was cold, ash within suggested a small fire in the early morning. Upon the iron fender lay a faint, glittering dust, as though a pinch of ground glass had been scattered there. What is it? I asked. Patient. He rose, went to the window, and examined the fastening, latched and dusty on the inner lip untouched. The balcony? Willoughby shook his head. There is none. Holmes tried the dressing-room door, which opened upon a neat space with a washstand and a row of gowns. He sniffed the air, and to my surprise, smiled briefly. Attar of roses, he observed. A more expensive grade than one expects in a country household. Mrs. Dorrit's indulgence, Hargreaves said, with the proper disapproval. She keeps a bottle. Does she indeed? Holmes lifted a lace cuff with 2 fingers and let it fall. His eye had gone to the curtain cord by the window, where the tassel hung with deceptive innocence. He tugged it, then examined the knot. Left-hand tie reversed. Our Miss Marsh is not left-handed. You cannot know that, Willoughby said weakly. On the contrary, I observed her writing case upon the table downstairs, the pens, nicked upon the right from a habit of pressing. Furthermore, the books beside her bed show the thumbwear of a right-handed reader. No, this knot is not hers. He paced twice round the bed, and came to rest by the small table upon which lay a silver bell, a glass carafe, and an open volume Shelley's poems. The glass showed a crescent at the rim, delineated by minute crystals. Salt, I suggested. Not common salt, Holmes murmured. He lifted the bell and peered beneath it as though expecting an apparition. Hargreaves, who first entered this room this morning? I did, sir, at 7. Miss Marsh did not respond to her maid's knock. I opened the door with the master's passkey and found her. The serpent lay there. He pointed to a place on the carpet at the foot of the bed. I confess, sir, I killed it with the poker. Where is the poker? In the scullery, sir. I feared the thing might yet live. Fetch it, said Holmes. When the butler had gone, Holmes sank to one knee at the indicated spot. Look, Watson. A smear, scarcely more than a breath. Iridescent, see how it catches? Not blood, not fat. I looked. The carpet there bore a faint stain that changed color as one shifted one's angle. Green, then violet, then a pearly white, like the sheen upon the serpent's scales. Opaline, Holmes said softly. Curious, very curious. He drew from his pocket a slip of litmus, which he moistened and lightly pressed to the stain. It blushed to a delicate rose, slightly acidic, and the dust upon the fender. Ah, we shall still have a merry dance. Hargreaves returned with the poker, a simple iron rod darkened by use. Near its tip, caught in a burr, clung a scale, pale as the moon. Thank you, Holmes said. He wrapped the tip in a scrap of paper and slipped it away. Now, Mr. Willoughby, you will oblige me with a brief tour of the grounds below Miss Marsh's window. We descended by a side stair and stepped out onto the east lawn. The grass retained the dampness of the morning. Holmes moved to a point directly beneath the window, where a low shrub spread its branches like a cowering thing. He stooped and sifted the earth with quick, sparing motions of his fingers. No ladder marks, he said. No footprints distinct enough to persuade a magistrate. But here, do you see, Watson? A thread. I saw it. A filament so fine I doubted my own eyes. A hair, perhaps. Holmes lifted it delicately. It was pale, almost white and crinkled with heat. Horsehair, I said. Not a horse, said Holmes. Silk, drawn filament, and sing. He pocketed it and, straightening, cast his eye along the wall. There is your chimney flue, Watson, narrow as a miser's heart. No reptile of 3 feet might essay it. The window is intact. The door was locked. Yet a serpent lay upon the carpet. Willoughby made a choking sound. Then you admit I admit nothing, Holmes said, with sudden sharpness. I observe. An observation tells me this. We stand in the midst of contrivance. We return to the house, where Mrs. Dorrit had installed herself in the corridor, with a bowl of lavender water and a lace handkerchief. She was a large woman of a kind that thinks tenderness a duty and curiosity a sacrament. At sight of us, she rose, dabbing at her eyes. Poor lamb, she murmured, and such a sweet, quiet lady. The Lord sends answers. Answers are not sent, Holmes said. They are gathered. He eyed her handkerchief, which bore 3 dark pinpricks along the hem. You sew without a thimble, Mrs. Dorrit. She looked flustered. Why, yes, sir. I have never liked the feeling. And your attar of roses is Persian, not French. Costly for a housekeeper, unless given. Her eyes flashed a momentary indignation, quickly replaced by piety. A Christmas gift, sir, from my late lady. God rest her. Holmes inclined his head. You were fond of Miss Marsh's mother. A saint, sir. And Mr. Willoughby is a generous master, as any in Surrey. Holmes' nostrils dilated, as if scenting a wind. He turned on his heel. Watson, he said, you will watch with Miss Marsh until the doctor returns. If her pulse quickens or her breathing shortens, call me at once. Mr. Willoughby, I shall require the keys to your library and your study, and permission to direct your servants for 1 hour. Willoughby, bewildered, handed over a small ring of keys. You have it, sir. Only will she live? Holmes' face, which could be very hard, softened by a degree. It is my business to make it so. He left us then, moving swiftly down the corridor, Hargreaves in his wake like a somber shadow. I took my station by the bed. For a time the only sounds were the quiet tick of the mantel clock and the soft whisper of Miss Marsh's breath. I found myself thinking of that faint opaline smear upon the carpet, of the glittering dust upon the fender, of the camphor in the serpent's head. The more I strove to assemble these fragments into a coherent picture, the more they slid, like bits of glass in a child's kaleidoscope, into new arrangements that dazzled and confounded. Some 20 minutes later, Holmes returned. His eyes had the bright, inward look of a man who has found a niche for a troublesome piece. He went at once to the dressing room and lifted the curtain cord tassel again. Reversed, he said, and yet no sign that it was drawn in the night. He stepped to the window and drummed with 2 fingers upon the glass. Watson, you remarked an odorous sweetness. Yes, floral. He nodded. It is not, I think, from Mrs. Dorrit's indulgence. It is, how shall I put it, the ghost of a different flower, not rose, something more Eastern, a joss stick. I was scared. Sandalwood? Nearer, he murmured, but not there. No matter. He paused at the bed and looked down at the girl. For an instant only, an instant the iron melted, and there was in his gaze a compassion that few would have credited. Then it was gone. Watson, he said quietly, there is a pattern here, but one thread is missing. This afternoon I shall visit your friend Dr. Remley to learn what he does not yet know he has learned. This evening, if I am correct, we shall ask Mr. Hargreaves to set a small stage. The actors are already cast. And the serpent? The serpent, said Holmes, turning to the door, has already shed its skin. He looked back with that sardonic twist of the lip which, in him, passed for mirth. Pray keep your revolver where you can reach it, Watson. I do not yet expect violence, but I have learned never to quarrel with prudence. He was gone again, leaving me with my patient, with the faltering light at the window, and with my own unsettled thoughts. I could not know then how many times I should revisit in memory the soft gleam at the carpet's edge, the silky pinch of dust upon the fender, the reverse knot of a tassel. Nor could I guess that before the moon had gone twice over Greyhaven, Holmes would place his hand upon a single delicate thread and draw upon it lightly, inexorably until the whole sinister fabric came away. Chapter the 3rd. Shadows in the library. The events of that afternoon remain vividly etched in my memory, not for any moment of violence, but for the singular and measured way in which Holmes began to unravel the tightly knotted threads of mystery that surrounded Greyhaven Hall. There was no flourish, no dramatic declaration, merely the quiet, relentless accumulation of facts, each as sharp and indispensable as the cog in a timepiece. Holmes left me to keep vigil at Miss Marsh's bedside, while he went in search of Dr. Remley, the local physician. For my part, I could do little more than observe. The young woman lay precisely as before, breathing shallowly, her expression as placid as though she were merely lost in some distant, sweet dream. Yet the faint bruise upon her wrist, and the unnatural torpor that held her body spoke of something far more sinister. I examined her once more with clinical precision, but the results were unchanged. No fever, no spasm, no sign of delirium. It was a calm too absolute, as though her body were a house with the door left open, but no inhabitant within. Mrs. Dorrit had stationed herself at the end of the corridor, like a self-appointed sentinel, offering prayers to anyone who would listen. Hargreaves came and went with the stately silence of a man who had seen the rise and fall of generations beneath one roof. The entire household moved under a pall, their conversations hushed, their glances laden with suspicion or fear. It was not until some 3/4 of an hour later that Holmes returned. His face bore that expression I had come to know so well, cold satisfaction mixed with something like intellectual amusement. "Remley is an honest man," he said, drawing a chair close to the bed and lowering his voice. "An honest man, but not an observant one." He concluded, quite sensibly, that no known venom matches the symptoms. But he failed to note a minor but telling detail. Holmes gestured toward Miss Marsh's wrist. "The bruise. It is not a puncture. It is a pressure mark oval, with a faint ridge at one end. The serpent did not bite her, Watson. It gripped her." I frowned. A constrictor? Too small. But something, or someone, pressed that creature to her skin for a reason not yet apparent. The venom, if it was, entered by another means, entirely, I echoed. Holmes merely tapped his index finger against his lips and said no more. We were soon summoned downstairs by Mr. Willoughby, who awaited us in the entrance hall. The poor man was visibly unraveled. His hands trembled as he clutched the banister. His usually measured speech came in bursts. "I have set aside the library for your use, Mr. Holmes," he said. "If it would aid your investigation in any way." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "I shall avail myself of your hospitality." The library of Greyhaven Hall was a handsome, if somewhat neglected, chamber. Tall bookcases lined 3 walls, their shelves crammed with volumes that had not been disturbed in decades, judging by the cobwebs strung like gossamer between their spines. A broad hearth occupied the 4th wall, with 2 armchairs drawn up before it, and a great oak writing desk under the central window. It was the sort of room in which generations of gentlemen might have debated politics, smoked long churchwarden pipes, and allowed the world to pass beyond their mullioned panes. Holmes paced slowly about the perimeter, hands clasped behind his back, eyes flicking from one detail to another, with a bird of prey's precision. He paused before the desk. "Willoughby," he said, "you keep this room locked?" "Always," replied the man. "I alone have the key." Holmes ran a finger along the edge of the blotter. "And yet," he murmured, "the dust lies unevenly. This corner has been brushed within the past 2 days. You have not been working here?" Willoughby colored faintly. "No, that is, not since Wednesday." "Today is Friday," Holmes replied. "Someone has sat here since Wednesday, and for more than a moment. Note the faint impression of a sleeve at the blotter's edge, and the displaced specks near the inkwell. I trust you will not take offense if I insist upon speaking with your staff, one by one." "Not at all," said Willoughby, though unease shadowed his face. Holmes called for Hargreaves first. The butler entered, tall and grave, his hands folded behind his back. "Hargreaves," said Holmes, in the clipped tone of a barrister who has had access to this library in the past 48 hours. "Only myself, sir, for the daily dusting, and Mrs. Dorrit wants to fetch a book for Miss Marsh." "What book?" "The Travels of Marco Polo, sir." The young lady was fond of reading before the fire. Holmes turned, quick as a whip. "And she returned it?" Hargreaves inclined his head. "She did, sir, the same evening. I replaced it myself upon the shelf." Holmes stepped to the indicated shelf and ran his finger along the row. It came away with a fine layer of dust except for one volume, near the center, whose surface was conspicuously clean. He drew it out. Marco Polo's Travels. He flipped it open, shook it gently. A faint puff of that same floral sweetness I had detected upstairs drifted into the air. He inhaled sharply, his eyes glittering. "Watson, smell." I did. The fragrance was subtle but unmistakable, a powdery, exotic scent, like dried blossoms crushed in silk. Holmes closed the book and ran his thumb along the page edges. "Do you observe, Watson, how the central section is slightly splayed, as though something lay within it for some time. Something thin, perhaps folded parchment, or... He tapped the spine thoughtfully. The question is not merely what was in this book, but why Miss Marsh or someone would choose it as a hiding place. Willoughby looked bewildered. Hiding place? Holmes did not answer directly. Hargreaves, he said, when Mrs. Dorrit came to fetch this book, was she alone? The butler thought for a moment. She was accompanied by Miss Marsh herself, sir. The young lady insisted on selecting the volume. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Did anyone else visit this room yesterday or the day before? No one, sir, Hargreaves said firmly. Holmes dismissed him with a nod. Send Mrs. Dorrit to me next. The housekeeper entered in a rustle of black bombazine, clutching the inevitable lace handkerchief to her breast. Mrs. Dorrit, Holmes began, when you fetched this book for Miss Marsh, did you notice anything unusual? Unusual, sir, she repeated. No, indeed. The young lady stood right beside me. And she handled the book herself? Yes, sir. She took it down, sneezed at the dust, and handed it to me. Sneezed, Holmes repeated thoughtfully. How long after that did the unfortunate event upstairs occur? The very next morning, sir. She retired early that night. Holmes leaned against the desk, fingers drumming. And you noticed nothing amiss in the library afterward? Nothing, sir. Though... She hesitated. Though what? Well, it may be nothing, she said, eyes darting nervously between us. But I thought I heard someone in this room late that night. A door closing softly. I told myself it was the wind. Holmes straightened at once. At what hour? Near midnight, sir. I was passing to my chamber. And you did not investigate? Her hands fluttered. No, sir. I was alone. Holmes dismissed her gently. When the door closed, he turned to me. Watson, the midnight visitor, the scent in the book, the reversed knot on the tasselet is a pattern, though incomplete. There is something here that was introduced into that room, and I believe this library is where it began. He returned to the desk, crouched, and inspected the floor beneath it. There, half hidden under the rug, lay a small scrap of white silk thread, curled like a worm. He held it up to the light. The same as beneath the window, he murmured. Silk singe, a filament. We are dealing with a design, Watson. A deliberate, careful mechanism. Holmes, I said, do you mean that the serpent was placed in Miss Marsh's room by human agency? He looked up sharply. What serpent slithers through a locked window, drags silk, and leaves floral powder in books? No, Watson. The serpent is the instrument, not the author. Before I could reply, a sudden muffled cry echoed faintly through the corridor. It was Hargreaves, calling up the stairs. Sir! Mr. Holmes. The stable boy Carter, he's gone. And the back gate standing wide. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. Watson, the game quickens. We must see where our serpent keeper has fled. Chapter the 4th. The first suspect, we hastened through the lower corridors of Greyhaven Hall, our footsteps echoing against the stone like a volley of distant drums. The fog outside had thickened once more, pressing against the windows like a living thing. By the time we reached the rear of the house, a cluster of servants had already gathered near the open gate. Their pale faces and murmured speculations told of the unease that had taken root in the household. Hargreaves stood apart from them, grim and immovable, like a figure carved in stone. The gate was discovered open not 10 minutes ago, sir, he reported to Holmes. Young Carter was nowhere to be found. His bunk is empty, his tools untouched. Holmes bent and examined the latch of the gate. It was a simple iron mechanism, well oiled, but the earth beneath was soft from the morning dew. His keen eyes moved with swift precision, noting every detail. Watson, he murmured, observe the indentation here, booted foot, small, heel worn, and another, wider, sharper at the toe. 2 individuals passed through here, one with the boy's slight step, the other, heavier. And here, look closely, do you see? I crouched beside him. There, pressed faintly into the earth, just beyond the gate, was a mark unlike any I had seen. A narrow, looping impression, as though some cord or rope had dragged across the ground. A length of silk, Holmes said softly. The same filament as in the library. Carter has not fled alone. Mr. Willoughby had joined us by now, his nightcoat thrown hastily over his clothing. Carter is a good lad, he said, voice trembling. He's never caused trouble. How long has he been in your employ? Holmes asked. 3 years. He came from a local family. His father was a groom before him. Reliable, quiet, though not particularly bright. Holmes straightened. Has he shown any unusual behavior of late? New acquaintances, sudden absences. Willoughby hesitated. Come to think of it, a fortnight ago, one of the maids remarked that he had been seen near the lane late at night, speaking with a stranger. I dismissed it at the time. We are a quiet parish, Mr. Holmes. Such things are easily overlooked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Strangers in quiet parishes are rarely without purpose. He turned to Hargreaves. When did you last see Carter? After supper, sir. He was attending to the horses. Did he appear agitated? No, sir. Quite his usual self. Holmes paced a few steps into the lane beyond the gate, where the fog hung in dense curtains. We shall find no clear trail tonight, he said. The fog will swallow all but the most obvious signs. Still, he stooped suddenly and lifted a scrap of fabric from a low thorn bush. It was a strip of coarse brown cloth, frayed at the edge, part of a stableman's jacket. Willoughby said at once. Holmes nodded. Our young friend departed in haste, and not entirely willingly. We returned to the house, where Holmes requested that the servants be assembled in the kitchen. It was a curious scene. The butler stiff and vigilant, the housekeeper tearful and officious, the two maids clinging to each other's arms like frightened sparrows. Holmes stood before them with an air of cold authority that brooked no trifling. One of your numbers, he began, has vanished through the back gate. Whether as fugitive or victim remains to be seen. But I warn you all there is more at stake here than idle secrets. I shall learn the truth. It would be better if you volunteered. A heavy silence followed. Then one of the younger maids, a rosy-cheeked girl named Susan, raised a trembling hand. Please, sir, she whispered. I saw him last night, Carter. He was in the stable yard after midnight. Holmes's gaze sharpened. What was he doing? She swallowed. Speaking to someone through the fence. I didn't see the face, sir, it was too dark, but I heard a voice. A man's voice. Low, like, could you distinguish anything he said? She shook her head. Only that Carter sounded frightened. Holmes dismissed the servants and turned to Willoughby. You must send word to the local constabulary at once. Carter may be a suspect, or he may be in danger. Either way, we must act swiftly. Willoughby nodded and departed to dispatch a groom with the message. Holmes and I then repaired to the library once more. The fire had been rekindled, and the room glowed with a warm, deceptive calm. Holmes sank into one of the armchairs, steepled his fingers, and stared into the flames. Watson, he said at length, let us consider what we know. A serpent of unknown origin found in a locked room. A young heiress rendered insensible by means other than a bite. Silk filaments in multiple locations. A book carrying a strange floral scent. And now a stable boy who meets with a stranger in the night and vanishes at the first sign of inquiry. Each piece alone might be explained away. Together, they form a tapestry. A tapestry of what? I asked. He smiled thinly. Of human design, my dear fellow. The serpent is not our criminal, it is our criminal's instrument. The silk threads, the scent, the reverse knot-all point to careful preparation. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to create the illusion of something unnatural, while in reality relying upon artifice. And Carter, ah, said Holmes, there lies our first suspect, a servant of long standing, impressionable, perhaps bribed or frightened into complicity. His sudden disappearance at this juncture is too timely to be coincidence. Whether he is a willing accomplice or a pawn remains to be seen. It was past midnight when the local constable, a stout, red-faced man named Inspector Yarrow, arrived at Greyhaven Hall. He listened to Willoughby's account with the air of one long accustomed to dealing with poachers and drunken brawlers, but Holmes's presence lent the matter a gravity he could not dismiss. Boys done a bunk, by the sound of it, Yarrow declared. We'll send men to search the woods at first light. The fog's too thick to do much now. Holmes regarded him with cool detachment. If the boy has fled voluntarily, Inspector, you will find signs of a prepared route, marks of cartwheels, perhaps, or footprints leading toward the road. If, however, he was taken, there may be other traces. I would be obliged if you would leave the searching to my methods come morning. Yarrow flushed but nodded. As you say, Mr. Holmes. The following dawn broke bleak and colorless. The fog lifted slightly, revealing a landscape soaked in dew and silence. Holmes was already outside by the time I rose, striding across the lawn like a lean greyhound. I joined him near the gate. Look here, Watson, he said, pointing to the earth. The heavier set of footprints veers sharply to the left, toward the copse. Carter's lighter prints follow. And here, this is what interests me. A set of parallel furrows ran along the edge of the path, faint but discernible. Holmes knelt to examine them. "A handcart," he murmured, "small with narrow wheels, recently oiled. See how clean the cut is? And the silk filament again caught on this briar." He rose, eyes alight. "Someone brought a conveyance to this gate under cover of darkness, led the boy o'er, took him toward the copse, and then disappeared into the fog. This is not the work of a wandering vagrant, Watson. This is a planned extraction." We followed the tracks into the tree. After some 20 yards, they ended abruptly near a narrow lane. Holmes scanned the ground minutely. He stooped and picked up a small object from the mud, a brass button, dulled with age, bearing the faint engraving of a serpent coiled upon itself. "Curious," he said softly, "very curious." We returned to the house to find Willoughby awaiting us in some agitation. "The constables found nothing in the village," he said. "No one saw Carter or any stranger pass through the lanes." "Then our quarry is clever," Holmes replied. "And close." Willoughby paled. "Close?" Holmes's gaze swept the house. "Yes. I believe that whoever orchestrated last night's events is no itinerant villain. They know the house. They know its routines. Carter's disappearance is but the first ripple in a larger disturbance." He turned to me, his expression sharpening. "Watson, this case now has a suspect, but we must be wary. For the true culprit, I suspect, watches us even now from within these very walls." Chapter V. The hidden clue dawn at Greyhaven brought no comfort to the heart, only a wan light that turned the lawns to pewter and laid long melancholy fingers down the corridors. Holmes, who could subsist upon an economy of sleep that would have ruined any other man, had been afoot before the breakfast gong, and had already made 2 circuits of the house when I found him in the east passage, his profile cut clean against the dim window, like a steel engraving. "Remley will return at 5, he said, without preamble. "Before then we must determine what was done, if not yet by whom. Come, Watson." We entered Miss Marsh's chamber once more. The girl still lay as she had so still that one might imagine time itself had put a gentle finger to her lips. Her pulse remained slow, and even her breathing, though shallow, showed no sign of distress. There was in the air the faint echo of that eastern sweetness which had teased us the previous day, as if the room remembered a perfume that had departed. Holmes executed a slow, deliberate circuit, his attention not upon the obvious but the neglected. He knelt again at the hearth, and the same minute glitter I had observed upon the fender winked up like frost at sunrise. "You recall this dust?" he murmured. "Yes, a crystalline powder." He did not answer. From his pocket he produced a narrow penknife and the tiniest of envelopes. With the care of a watchmaker he teased a few grains from the iron and slid them away. Then his eye went not to the carpet, nor the curtains, but to the least honored object in the room, the bell-pull. He tugged it lightly. It yielded with a soft stir of the tassel. "Do you mark, Watson, that the cord is frayed on the inner side alone, as though abraded by tension applied not downwards, but obliquely, and that the tassel's knot still reverse bears a smear that is neither wax nor dust, but something between?" He pressed the knot with the blades flat and peered at what clung there. "What do you see, Holmes?" He closed the penknife, and the singular hooded look with which he sometimes masked his mind slid over his features. "An indication," he said, "and a promise of more. Pray fetch me, from the dressing-room, the narrow ribbon we observed yesterday binding the gloves." I complied. He examined the ribbon, held it against the bell cord, and then apparently satisfied returned it to me, with a nod that told me nothing. He crossed to the silver bell upon the bedside table, lifted it, and again inspected the glass carafe beside it. The crescent of crystalline residue still limned the rim like frost. Holmes took up the glass, held it to the light, and smiled a glacial expression that signaled not mirth but geometry finding its line. "Watson, do you observe that the deposit is thicker on the side nearest the bed? Gravity acts even on poison. And note the carafe, full to the shoulder, but the stopper's inner lip shows a film, as though pressed by damp fingers that had first handled powder. You are suggesting nothing. I am looking." He set the glass down, turned to the window latch, and measured the inner sill against his lens with uncharacteristic exactness. "Dust continues. No external entry." He moved to the dressing-room threshold and stooped, not to the skirting, nor to the garments, but to the hinge of the door itself, where, lodged in the cup like a spider's catch, lay a tiny sphere no larger than the head of a pin. He slipped it out with his blade and trapped it on his thumbnail. "What in heaven's name is that?" I asked. Holmes blew upon it lightly. The sphere rolled, flashed opaline for a breath, and was gone vanished with the faintest hiss. "Nothing of consequence," said he, too quickly, and in the same motion he drew his handkerchief, dabbed the hinge, and turned away. The mask had dropped. The secret, whatever it was, had now a place in that mental strong-box of his, from which no force short of his own caprice could extract it. I confess to a moment's irritation. "You will tell me what you saw," I protested. "In due course, my dear fellow. At present I prefer to silence conjecture with fact. Come." He led me down to the library. The early light fell flat upon the long rows of books, and dust so fine as to be almost a memory hung suspended like a scrim. Holmes went straight to the shelf from which the travels of Marco Polo had been taken. With a touch he drew out, not that volume, but the one to its immediate left, a fat quarto, a voyage's end, rapped its spine gently. A whisper of powder rose, the same sweet ghost that had haunted the bedchamber. He smiled without warmth. "Our perfumer has a clumsy thumb. See how the powder runs along the top edges? And here where the volumes kiss an arc of transfer, as neat as any chalk line. Someone used these books as both file and funnel. For what? Patience." He slid the volume back, then bent beneath the desk as if to adjust the rug. When he rose, he had between finger and thumb a thread as delicate as a cobweb, pale, and if my eyes did not deceive me, singed. "The third such filament," I said. "The fourth," Holmes corrected. "I found its twin upon the newel last night. It is the nature of clever contrivances to shed small betrayals." At that moment the door opened, and Hargreaves entered, portentous as ever. "Breakfast is served, sir." Holmes inclined his head. "Mr. Hargreaves, you are a man of conscience. Do you also possess a good ear?" The butler permitted himself the faintest of frowns. "I endeavor to, Mr. Holmes." "Then favor me with recollection. On the evening before Miss Marsh was found, did you hear any sound, however slight, at a late hour? A bell chiming once when it should have been silent, a soft thrum of cord, a falling object muffled by fabric?" Hargreaves compressed his lips. "There was a single note from the dinner gong, sir, just before midnight. I attributed it to a draught." Holmes' eyes flashed. "Draughts do not strike gongs," he said, half to himself. "Thank you, Hargreaves. That is all. We shall attend at once." During breakfast, which I confess I scarcely tasted, Holmes ate with his usual efficient indifference, his mind, like a lean greyhound, running far ahead. Willoughby attempted conversation, but the effort sat upon him as ill as a borrowed coat. Every few moments his gaze drifted to the stair, as though he might carry Miss Marsh down by will alone. "Mr. Willoughby," Holmes said suddenly, "was Miss Marsh in the habit of receiving correspondence?" "Very little," he replied. "A cousin in Bath writes at intervals. A former governess sent a Christmas card last year. She has few acquaintances. A young lady of fortune with a guardian seldom has as few acquaintances as the guardian supposes," Holmes returned dryly. "Your post arrives?" "Daily. Hargreaves receives it. Then afterwards I shall take the liberty of consulting your waste-paper basket." Willoughby stiffened. "Is that necessary?" Holmes' glance was as chill as a blade. "If you prefer, sir, that I depart for London and leave you to the charitable conjectures of Inspector Yarrow, say so at once. Otherwise we must pursue truth by the paths that present themselves." Willoughby colored and subsided into apology. Holmes waved it away and finished his coffee. "Watson," said he, "we shall divide our efforts. I will examine the post and the study. You, if you please, will visit the stables in company with Hargreaves. Ask for Carter's effects. Do not allow anything to be tidied until I have seen it. Look specifically for paper, string, wax, and any recent purchases, oils, powders, or cheap jewelry. If the boy was tempted, it was not by literature. And if he was frightened, then you will find what fright does best, the trace of haste. Off you go." I confess that a tour of outbuildings seldom sets my pulse alight, yet on this morning the stables of Greyhaven had about them the glamour of the theatre's wing. Everything was ordinary, and therefore each thing invited scrutiny. The stalls held 2 hunters and a placid mare. The harness room was in tolerable order, a smell of oiled leather and hay mingled in the air. Hargreaves produced a small wooden chest from beneath a bench. "Carter's box," he said. I opened it upon a miscellany, a woolen muffler, a cheap tin of blacking, a broken penknife, 2 crumpled bills from a Guildford public house, and a scrap of paper folded upon itself. This last bore, when smoothed, a crude drawing circle within circle, and at the center a serpent, coil to tail, its scales sketched with the heavy hand of the untaught. Beneath it, in a fist as ignorant as it was forceful, the words, Keep faith and keep silent. Good Lord, I murmured. Hargreaves leaned closer. His iron face did not change, but his breath shortened. I have never seen that, sir. Nor, I fancy, has Mr. Willoughby, I said. We shall show it to Mr. Holmes. In the corner of the room, upon a low shelf, I found something else. A coil of silk cord, fine as fishing line and half spent, and beside it, a doll-sized handbell hammer-no, longer than the breadth of my hand, its head scuffed and faintly greased. The grease smelled faintly sweet. Did Carter ever ring the dinner gong? On occasion, said Hargreaves, from a distance. The butler's eyes went colder still. He would strike it with the mallet like any other man, sir. What do you imply? Nothing yet. I wrapped the items in the drawing in a cloth. As I lifted the coil, a single stray filament slid free, pale, crinkled, and darkened at one end, as though caressed by flame. When I rejoined Holmes in the study, he was seated upon the hearthrug amid a neat chaos of envelopes. His long fingers traveled over them as if they were the strings of a curious instrument. He looked up when I entered, and the fractional lift of his brows told me that what I bore would find an echo in what he had discovered. News? He asked. I placed the drawing, the bell hammer, and the cord before him. He examined the hammer, sniffed, and nodded. Tuberose oil, he said, blended with benzoin and orris. Our floral ghost has a name. Tuberose of the greenhouses, I said. An uncommon luxury. Not, I think, when purchased by the drama in London, Holmes returned. And your drawing? I told him. He turned the paper over. A smear of the same sweet grease made a pale crescent on the reverse, like a thumbprint left by a phantom. He tucked the drawing away. And you? I asked in turn. He held up 3 envelopes, 2 from the Bath cousin, 1 from a Bond Street Emporium perfumer's paper. Empty save for a dusting of powder that stains the finger like flour and smells of our Eastern Frank. It was addressed to Miss Marsh and posted 2 days before her collapse. Good God. Someone sent the scent, or the means to employ it, Holmes said. We are confronted with a person who understands 3 things: the suggestibility of servants, the malleability of appearances, and the patience of mechanism. He gestured toward the bell hammer. You see? A cord from here. He mimed a line through the air to the dinner gong, then through a transom, over a pulley, to the bell pull in Miss Marsh's room, where a knot, reversed, holds it at the necessary angle. At midnight, a slight tug, one clear note to allay suspicion, as if a draught had swayed the gong, and elsewhere a jar, a fall, or a door drawn softly to. Holmes, I cried, you believe the serpent was released by a thread, and directed by one, he said, but not a living serpent in the usual sense. Remember your medical nose and my lens. The head is preserved with camphor, the belly cut and closed. Something was housed within it, Watson, something that responded to heat, to gravity, or to a dissolving thread. Your hinge-lodged sphere. Here his eyes twinkled for a fraction of an instant. A confession hidden within a mockery was a clue of the smallest possible order. What was it? He smiled, that smile which has driven more confessions from guilty men than any threat could, cool, inexorable, and faintly amused. A seed, he said, and that, for the present, is all. I confess to exasperation. You will not trust me? I trust you with my life, he returned, and the quiet sincerity of it silenced me at once, but not with my assumptions. Let us wait for one more grain to fall. Meanwhile, prepare yourself. This evening I shall require your assistance with an experiment. Hargreaves must lay a table in Miss Marsh's room precisely as it stood. He will not like it, but he will obey. And Mr. Willoughby. Holmes rose, dusting his knees, and looked for a moment at the portrait above the mantel, a lady of middle years, grave and handsome, with a steadiness in her eyes that I fancied Miss Marsh had inherited. His own gaze softened by a degree. Mr. Willoughby must be told nothing beyond what we cannot help him to see. Holmes, I ventured, do you suspect him? I suspect everyone who benefits from a young woman's silence, he answered. But profit is sometimes counted in coins that leave no ledger. There is jealousy, there is fear, there is the long arithmetic of pride. No, let us not yet hang our man. First we must prove our serpent. He slipped the perfumer's envelope into his pocket, along with the drawing and the filament, and turned at the door. One more errand, Watson. Send a wire to Whitehall, our friend at the Botanical Room. Ask him for the properties, vapors, and household uses of the tuberose, the orris, and the benzoin. Add a line on the effects of finely powdered glass upon a moist surface. The fender dust, I exclaimed. Perhaps, he said, and the corners of his mouth twitched, or perhaps a decoy for the keen and the careless alike. We shall see whose eyes we are meant to borrow. He had his hat in his hand when Hargreaves appeared at the threshold, a shade paler than before. "Sir," said the butler, "a constable has come from the village. They have found the handcart empty?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir. But there was this, caught in the hedge." He held out a small object on his immaculate palm, a second brass button, twin to the first, the serpent upon it coiled into the shape of an opal oval. Holmes took it, weighed it lightly, and looked up the stairs. "The stage is nearly set," he said. "To work, Watson. Before this day is out, I intend to make our serpent strike in the presence of witnesses and leave the hand that guides it no place to hide." Chapter Fee. Rising tension at Greyhaven that afternoon at Greyhaven Hall unfolded under a peculiar and mounting pressure, as though the house itself were holding its breath. The fog that had lingered since dawn began to thin, revealing a cold, colorless sky. But inside, beneath the high ceilings and along the long corridors, the sense of unease only deepened. The servants went about their duties in hushed tones. Mrs. Dorrit could be heard muttering prayers under her breath, and even the stoic Hargreaves moved with the taut solemnity of a man who expects calamity at any hour. Holmes, for his part, was at his most inscrutable. Having spent the morning making quiet, deliberate investigations through the rooms and grounds, he now withdrew into the library, where he could be found seated in one of the high-backed armchairs, his long fingers pressed together, and his gaze fixed upon the dying embers in the hearth. He gave no hint of his thoughts. On more than one occasion I entered hoping for some indication of his line of reasoning, only to be waved away with a distracted flick of his hand. Shortly after noon, a carriage approached along the drive, its wheels crackling over the frozen gravel. Inspector Yarrow emerged, accompanied by 2 constables. His ruddy complexion was now tinged with the chill of the outdoors, and he bore the expression of a man who had been roused from comfortable certainties into a problem larger than he had anticipated. "We searched the woods, Mr. Holmes," Yarrow said, as we met him in the vestibule. "No sign of the boy. The handcart was found where the lane forks toward Farnham. No tracks after that. Whoever took him knew these woods well, or else vanished onto the main road with a waiting conveyance." Holmes regarded him coolly. "And the hedge?" "A few threads caught, as you saw, nothing else." Holmes nodded, his face unreadable. "Inspector, Greyhaven is not threatened by any passing ruffian. You are dealing with intelligence, forethought, and if I am not mistaken, an intimacy with the household that is greater than Mr. Willoughby imagines. If you and your men would be so good as to keep your presence discreet, I shall endeavor to give you your quarry." Yarrow looked dubious. "You've a suspect, then?" Holmes's lips curled faintly. "Several." The tension grew sharper in the early afternoon. A message arrived by wire from Whitehall in response to Holmes's earlier inquiries. I found him standing at the library window, the telegram crumpled in his hand, his eyes alight with a hard brilliance. "Well?" I asked. "The botanical room confirms it," he said. "Powdered tuberose, when combined with benzoin and finely ground glass, forms a dust that adheres to moist surfaces such as lips, throats, or mucous membranes, and produces, when inhaled or ingested in sufficient quantities, a gentle but persistent narcosis. No known antidote. The effect dissipates only with time, and if the powder is delivered in a concentrated burst, unconsciousness follows within minutes." "Good heavens," I murmured. "Then Miss Marsh's condition was induced deliberately," Holmes said, "not by the serpent's bite, but by the scent and dust. The serpent was a mask. The real agent was in the air she breathed and the glass she drank." He turned toward the fire. "Consider, Watson. A letter arrives containing scented powder. A book carries the same. A reversed cord and a midnight mechanism bring about some calculated movement in her room, perhaps the release of the serpent, or perhaps merely the drawing of attention. In the confusion that follows, the faint dust upon the fender, the powder on the glass, these are dismissed as trivial, when in fact they are the core of the crime. But to what end?" I demanded. "Why should anyone wish to incapacitate Miss Marsh?" "That," said Holmes quietly, "is the question upon which all else depends." As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the house became almost unbearable. Willoughby paced the corridors in agitation, torn between his paternal concern for his ward and his bewilderment at the unfolding mystery. The servants whispered among themselves. The 2 constables Yarrow had stationed discreetly near the kitchen did little to ease the air of suspicion. It was late in the afternoon when Holmes summoned me to Miss Marsh's room. The wan light of the sinking sun lay across the bed like a shroud. Holmes was crouched near the window, not examining the sill this time, but the space between the wall and the wainscoting. "Watson," he said softly, "do you recall the bell cord?" "Of course. It was reversed to create tension," he said. "But here's the other end of the story." He produced a length of narrow silk cord, frayed at one end, caught in the crack between wall and board. The other end was cut cleanly. "Whatever was tied to this cord," he murmured, "was severed deliberately, and not long Agartha silk is neither stiffened by dust nor damp with condensation. Someone returned to this room after the incident to retrieve something." Before I could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor. It was Hargreaves, his usually impassive face now taut. "Sir," he said to Holmes. Miss Marsh stirred. Holmes was at the bedside in an instant, his hand on her wrist, his gaze fixed upon her face. For a moment there was nothing. Then, faintly, like a wind stirring through leaves, her lips moved. "Eleanor," Willoughby whispered from the doorway. Holmes held up a hand for silence. Her eyelids fluttered, and a single word escaped her throat, hoarse and fragile: "Serpent." Then she lapsed once more into unconsciousness. Holmes straightened slowly, his face thoughtful. "Her mind clings to the illusion," he said. "Excellent. That tells us something very important." "What?" I asked. "That the deception succeeded even in the mind of the victim," he replied. "She believes the serpent struck her, and belief is the final curtain our culprit hoped to draw." Toward evening, Holmes ordered the entire household assembled in the great drawing room. It was a curious gathering. Willoughby pale but resolute, Mrs. Dorrit dabbing at her eyes, the maids huddled together like frightened birds, Hargreaves standing sentinel behind his master's chair, and Inspector Yarrow watching with arms folded, his skepticism tempered by curiosity. Holmes stood by the mantelpiece, his tall frame cutting a stark figure against the firelight. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I am not here to frighten you, nor to cast accusations lightly, but I must tell you plainly. The incident involving Miss Marsh was no accident. It was planned, down to the last filament of silk. Someone in this house, someone with knowledge of its routines, has conspired to incapacitate her using powders and mechanisms intended to mimic a supernatural visitation. The serpent was not the author, but the tool." A murmur swept through the room. Mrs. Dorrit let out a soft cry. One of the maids began to sob. Holmes continued, his voice clear and commanding. "The mechanism is subtle, the motive yet obscure, but the hand that set it in motion is here among us. I have reason to believe that within the next 24 hours, that same hand will make another move, and when it does, I intend to be watching." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Until then," he said, "I ask that no one leave the house. Inspector Yarrow's men will ensure this. Any attempt to flee will be taken as an admission of guilt." Yarrow barked a short, satisfied order to his men. The servants looked stricken. Willoughby sank back in his chair, staring at Holmes with something approaching reverence. When the gathering dispersed, Holmes lingered by the fire, hands clasped behind his back. "Watson," he murmured, "the stage is set. Our serpent has struck once. It will strike again, but next time it shall find us waiting." I glanced toward the darkened staircase leading up to Miss Marsh's room, and felt, for the first time in this affair, a chill that was not merely of the fog. Chapter the 7th. Misdirection deepens. It was shortly after midnight when I awoke to the faint sound of footsteps in the corridor. The house lay in that peculiar nocturnal silence which belongs only to the country, the stillness broken not by the hum of the city, but by the occasional settling of beams or distant hoot of an owl. Yet the tread I heard was not the careless step of a servant. It was measured, cautious, almost feline. I rose, dressed quickly, and took up my revolver, a habit born of my time in Afghanistan, which Holmes had never dissuaded. Opening the door an inch, I saw a figure glide past the faint light cast by the landing lamp. It was tall, cloaked in a dark dressing gown, and moved toward the east wing, toward Miss Marsh's chamber. "Holmes!" I whispered under my breath, certain that no one else moved with such spectral silence. But then the figure turned the corner, and for an instant the lamp caught the face, not Holmes's keen hawk-like features, but the pale, strained countenance of Mr. Henry Willoughby. I slipped out after him. He moved down the corridor with evident familiarity, pausing only once to glance behind, though I flattened myself against the paneling in time. He reached Miss Marsh's door, stood a moment listening, then placed his hand upon the knob. But before he could turn it, A soft voice cut through the silence. "May I ask what you intend, Mr. Willoughby?" Holmes emerged from the shadows at the far end of the corridor, his dressing gown belted tightly, his eyes glinting in the lamplight. Willoughby started back as though struck. "Holmes, why are you awake at this hour?" "For the same reason you are," Holmes replied coldly, "to watch." Willoughby's hands fluttered. I could not sleep. "I came to look in on her. She is like a daughter to me." Holmes's voice softened slightly, but his gaze did not waver. "No doubt. Yet the hour is late, and the mind plays tricks in the dark. Return to your room, sir. Miss Marsh is watching." For a moment Willoughby seemed on the point of protest. Then his shoulders slumped. "Very well," he murmured, and turned back down the corridor. Holmes watched him until he disappeared. I stepped forward. "You were following him," I said. "Not following, waiting," Holmes replied. "A man who prowls at midnight often reveals more than by daylight. Do you suspect him?" Holmes gave a noncommittal shrug. "I suspect everyone, Watson. But suspicion is not proof. Willoughby may be anxious, or he may be guilty. Time will tell." The next morning dawned clear but bitterly cold, a pale sun struggling against the skeletal branches of the trees. The household awoke to the news of a curious discovery. Inspector Yarrow's men had found Carter's stable jacket, muddy and torn, beneath a hedgerow less than a mile from Greyhaven. The strip of cloth Holmes had found at the gate matched the tier exactly. There were no signs of Carter himself. Yarrow arrived shortly before breakfast, stamping his boots and bearing the air of a man who disliked mysteries interfering with his usual routines. "Found the boy's jacket, Mr. Holmes," he announced. "No blood, no body, just tossed aside. My men are sweeping the area." Holmes accepted the news with quiet interest. "And the button? Still missing," Yarrow said. "We found no trace of who he was with. No cart, no horse, nothing." "Nothing is often something," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to the inspector, especially when it vanishes so neatly. After breakfast, Holmes requested that Willoughby, Mrs. Dorrit, Hargreaves, and both maids assemble in the drawing room once more. I could feel the tension prickling the air as the small company gathered, each face marked by its own shade of apprehension. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, standing before the hearth, "the incident that befell Miss Marsh was the result of deliberate calculation. We have established that a powder of narcotic and irritant properties was used, and that silk cords and other contrivances played a part in introducing a serpent or something like it into her room. These facts are no longer in dispute. The question before us is, who in this household could have orchestrated such a plan?" A shiver went through the maids. Mrs. Dorrit's hand flew to her breast. Willoughby's brow furrowed in indignation. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "you cannot seriously suggest nothing." Holmes interrupted. "I observe, and I have observed, certain things. Mr. Hargreaves, for instance." The butler stiffened, though his composure did not falter. "You keep the household keys. You control the bell system. You were the first to enter Miss Marsh's room. You could have tampered with the cord unnoticed. And yet your alibi is unimpeachable. At the hour in question, you were seen by 2 servants in the kitchen corridor. Your conduct, therefore, while not above suspicion, does not fit the pattern." Hargreaves bowed his head slightly, neither relieved nor affronted. "Mrs. Dorrit," Holmes continued, turning to the housekeeper, "your fondness for perfume is well known. You had access to the library with Miss Marsh, and you knew where the powder was stored. Yet the reverse knot on the tassel required a left-handed action, and you are most emphatically right-handed. Furthermore, you sleep in a room adjoining the kitchen. To reach Miss Marsh's door at midnight would require you to pass 3 servants. It is improbable." Mrs. Dorrit crossed herself fervently. "The maids," Holmes went on, "are too timid to have devised such a scheme. They may be drawn into it unwittingly, but they are not the authors." His gaze shifted to Willoughby. The room seemed to still be there. "You, sir, have both motive and opportunity. Motive, because as Miss Marsh's guardian, her incapacitation or worse would place control of her inheritance temporarily in your hands. Opportunity, because you possess unrestricted access to every room in this house. And last night, you were found outside her chamber at an hour when honest men sleep." Willoughby flushed crimson. "How dare you?" Holmes raised a hand. "I observe, Mr. Willoughby, I do not accuse. Yet it is the nature of misdirection that the most obvious suspect may not be the true culprit. Consider, Watson," he turned to me suddenly, "if one wished to divert attention, were better to place suspicion than upon the guardian with both means and apparent motive. The room was silent. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The serpent of this affair has more than one coil. We must not seize the first that touches our feet. Later that day, Holmes and I walked the grounds together. The winter air was bracing, and the frost crunched beneath our boots. Holmes's eyes swept the hedgerows, the paths, the house itself, as if he were committing each line to memory. "Watson," he said suddenly, "have you considered the possibility that Carter is neither victim nor accomplice but bait?" I started. "Bait, suppose," Holmes continued, "that someone wished to distract both the constabulary and ourselves from the true heart of the matter. What better way than to create a false trail, a missing servant, a mysterious stranger, a discarded cart? Inspector Yarrow chases phantoms, while here, beneath our very noses, the real work continues." "But Carter was seen speaking to a stranger," I objected. "Indeed, but who told us this? A maid, frightened, half-seeing through fog. The idea of the stranger is all that is required. It does not follow that he exists." We walked in silence for a moment. The house loomed against the pale sky, its many windows catching the weak sunlight like watchful eyes. "Watson," Holmes said finally, "before this day is over, something will happen. The serpent has not struck its final blow. It will seek to do so again perhaps tonight." That evening, Holmes gave orders to Yarrow's men to maintain a silent watch on the perimeter. He himself took up position in a small anteroom adjacent to Miss Marsh's chamber, from which he could observe the corridor through a narrow crack in the door. I remained inside the young lady's room with a lamp turned low, my revolver within reach. The faint scent of tuberose still lingered like the memory of a dream. The hours dragged by with agonizing slowness. Midnight passed, the wind whispered against the panes. Somewhere in the distance, a nightjar called. Then, faintly, I heard it, the softest thrum, as of a cord under tension. Holmes's silhouette stiffened in the doorway. A single chime echoed through the house. The dinner gong. Holmes moved like lightning. "Watson, watch the curtain," he hissed. I turned just in time to see the bell cord tremble, though no hand touched it, and from the shadows above the wardrobe, something dropped. But this time Holmes was ready. Chapter the 8th. Holmes planned the thing fell with a soft, sinister patter as if a length of damp rope had slid from a loft and struck the prepared surface with scarcely a sound. For a heartbeat I was not certain what I saw then. The net Holmes had strung above the carpet took the weight, sagged, and held. A pale shape writhed against the mesh, no living sinew, but a gruesome simulacrum that, even now, made the hair move coldly upon my scalp. It was the serpent again, or its twin, opaline, 3 feet in length, its wedge head gaping faintly. "Lamp higher, Watson, but do not stir the air," Holmes snapped, already at the bed curtain. With 2 quick motions he drew them close to Miss Marsh, and by some cunning little contrivance previously set there, pinned the muslin in a narrow seam, so that only a slit remained for her breath. He moved with the velocity of a fencer, then he was at the window, lifting the lower sash by an inch to create a stealing draught. The scent of the corridor receded, as a tide does when seized by a stronger moon. "Keep your place," he added in a voice that was scarcely a whisper. "The trap is sprung." All this occupied no more than 10 seconds. By the time I had steadied the lamp, Holmes had knelt to the net and, with forceps from his pocket case, pinched up the pallid head by the back of the jaw. What looked like a tongue within was no tongue at all, but a small, dark valve. He pinched it, a brief susurrus escaped the thing, and a faint sweetness, like the last sigh of a dying blossom, touched my nostrils. "Enough," murmured Holmes, and pressed a moistened cloth prepared beforehand from the basin over the mock head. He held it there. The sound ceased. I saw then what the net had concealed. Beneath the serpent, fused to its belly by 2-minute seams of wax, was a glass ampoule no bigger than a walnut, wrapped in a gauze of silk. Threaded through the gauze, like the ribs of a dragonfly's wing, ran the palest of cords. "Do you mark, Watson?" he said without looking up. "A fall of 3 feet shatters the ampoule. The silk spreads the dust. A valve directs the breath toward a victim's face. Ingenious, diabolically simple." A step sounded in the corridor, then another. Holmes did not even raise his head. "Quietly," he breathed. The door moved a hair's breadth. A draught grazed my cheek. I saw the latch quiver no more. Somewhere farther off, as if in answer to a signal, the dinner gong spoke a single, soft note, like a muffled heart, then silence. Holmes waited as a cat waits, every nerve tuned to that other presence. I could hear my own pulse. At length the latch was still again, the stealth receded. Only then did my friend draw the net carefully together and close it about the pale instrument like a surgeon tying a cautery bag. "Watson," he said, in a tone that released me at last, "be so good as to fetch Inspector Yarrow. Do not run, do not call. Bring him, and Hargreaves also. I shall not move from this spot." I obeyed, and in a few minutes returned with the inspector heavy on my heel and the butler close behind, the latter grave as ever, but with a glitter in his eye that betrayed extraordinary strain. Holmes rose, and with a little bow, as if introducing some notable guest, presented the netted coil. "Gentlemen, the Opal Serpent, of which the scriptures make no mention, but London's emporia supply in parts." Yarrow stared. "It, Lord save us, another of the beasts." "Not a beast," said Holmes evenly. "A vessel. Step nearer but slowly." He drew the lamp so that its light fell across the thing's underside. Even the inspector, a man not easily nauseated, uttered a low exclamation. The glass ampoule, cracked but not wholly broken thanks to the net, was veined with a powder as white as the first fall upon a winter field. Between its shards sat a fragment of some darker matter, and I perceived, with a start, the microscopic glitter of those same crystalline motes Holmes had gathered from the fender. "Powder of tuberose and benzoin, tempered with finely ground glass," Holmes said. "Our floral ghost in a more robust apparition. You will note this valve." He touched the false tongue lightly with his forceps, "and these wax seams. The serpent is stitched and sealed as a parcel would be. The cord, Inspector, runs not to any charm or conjurer, but to a pulley in the wardrobe cornice, then beneath the molding, and if I mistake not, through the wall to the service passage behind. We may follow it at leisure without disturbing our witness." "Witness?" Yarrow echoed blankly. "Miss Marsh," said Holmes, with a sideways flick of the eyes, "who, if roused tomorrow with care, will recall only that the serpent dropped once more. She will not remember the draught I set, nor the cloth that stifled its breath. She will remember what she meant. We, however, have seen what we were meant to miss." Hargreaves' jaw had set like oak. "Sir," he said, "if there is such a contrivance in Miss Marsh's chamber, it shall be pulled down before the hour strikes twice. On the contrary," Holmes returned, "it shall remain. But I shall add one improvement." He rose, wrapped the net about its quivering cargo, and placed it within the glass dome of a cloche that had previously covered a bowl of fruit upon the table. He weighted the edge with a heavy book, Shelley's poems, that instrument of poetry that has served many masters today. "There, the serpent may pant itself to sleep. The gentleman who tugs upon cords shall find only silence at the other end." Yarrow, wiping his brow, gathered his authority. "We must search the passages now, Mr. Holmes. Set men at every door." "In a moment," said Holmes. "First, two announcements. The first is for you, Inspector. The hand we seek is left-handed. The second is for you, Mr. Hargreaves. Kindly, with your usual precision, lock Miss Marsh's door, keep the key upon your person, and admit no one saves Dr. Remley when he arrives at 5. Meanwhile, we will take a little stroll behind the walls." He took up the lamp and beckoned. We passed from the chamber into the dressing-room, where he drew aside the washstand and exposed a modest wooden panel, dented by long use. A narrow door, cunningly papered to match the wall, stood revealed. "Staff passage," said Hargreaves, in a tone that conceded nothing and admitted everything. "Just so." Holmes opened it, and we entered a cramped corridor that ran behind a row of bedchambers, like a vein behind the knuckles. The air smelled of dust and old soap. A little way along, where the back of Miss Marsh's wardrobe projected, Holmes held up the lamp and laid his hand to the plaster. His fingers found a flaw, the panel shifted. There, snug against the inner lintel, lay a tiny brass pulley and a guiding eyelet. From the eyelet trailed a strand of that same pale silk, vanishing upward into darkness. "The tail of our serpent," Holmes murmured. "Up, I think." A narrow stair rose at the passage's end to the low attics. We climbed, Yarrow grunting behind us. In the angle above Miss Marsh's room, beneath a blackened beam, the cord ran to a second pulley fixed to the timber. A small weight hung from the free end, a pear-shaped bob of lead, grease-dark where a hand had often grasped it. Beside the pulley, upon the joist, someone had set a little shelf. Upon it, a box of wax pellets, a coil of silk, and a folded handkerchief whose corner bore, in ink, the letter F. Holmes did not touch the cloth. "You see the economy of the design. A light tug on the weighted end lifts the serpent previously placed upon its shelf of demand at a chosen moment. The wax that holds the ampoule is freed by the heat of the chimney flue. Here he pointed to a thin pipe that rose alongside the beam, or by the simple expedient of a lamp set below. The glass falls, breaks, and the breath goes forth. The rest is an illusion. Yarrow crouched, peering. And who, Mr. Holmes, keeps a private shelf in Greyhaven's rafters? Someone who has been here long enough to know the house's bones, Holmes returned. Someone who works in silence, with the patience to thread silk through papered cracks. Someone with a left hand trained to reverse knots. He glanced at Hargreaves. Your staff have free run of these passages? Not by right, the butler answered. By temptation, perhaps. I cannot keep men from cobwebs if they set their minds to them. Holmes' nostrils flared. He inhaled the dust, the old wood, the ghost of a tar that seemed to haunt even this hidden place. He took up the handkerchief with the point of his forceps and held it to the lamp. The fabric was smudged with a faint bloom of powder when he shook it. The air caught for a heartbeat, that sweet dry breath we now knew too well. He folded the thing again and tucked it away. Later, he said. Yarrow shifted. Shall I set a man up here? Two, Holmes replied, quiet as church mice and as patient. They will watch the weight and the cord. No one is to touch this apparatus until I say. Now back to earth. When we returned to the corridor, Holmes paused at the gong in the great hall. It hung in the half-light like a moon, faintly blemished by lamp smoke. He ran a finger along its rim and smiled. Lampblack, he said softly. He held up his hand. The pad of his finger was smudged with soot. When a man wishes to know who has touched a thing, he has but to lay a whisper of soot where skin must press. The dinner gong's tongue that night bore a kiss of carbon. The hand that tugged the serpent could not resist the reassurance of a token note. Thus, it has told us, who reassured himself. You mean? Yarrow began. I mean that before breakfast we shall look for a smudge. No housemaid's diligence would think to remove from the second joint of the left forefinger. Remember it. He moved on, and in a quieter voice to me, that and one more mark. I brushed the serpent's cord, at a certain point, with a paste of aniline blue that will leave the mildest trace upon warm skin. Our gentleman of nerves will carry, upon the heel of his hand, the ghost of my kiss till dawn. I could not bear a little admiration. You planned this from the beginning? I planned for someone, he returned. It remains to learn precisely who. Holmes kept the household close through the small hours, busy with harmless labors that to the uninitiated would have seemed fussy and irrelevant. He sent Hargreaves to make a careful list of the keys in his possession, asked Mrs. Dorrit, with perfect gravity, for a full account of the perfume she had ever owned, and from whom received, directed Inspector Yarrow to station his men, one at the foot of the attic stair, one at the turn of the service passage, and one beneath the east lawn where the silk had been snared before. To me he entrusted the most humiliating of errands, to stroll, as if idle, in the breakfast room, the library, the stare-observing hands. Watson, he murmured, there is nothing so revealing as a gentleman washing when he thinks himself unobserved. Powder sinks into the crease where water will not wholly reach. Look for a fretful man, over-scrupulous with the towel, and if I find three, then we shall choose by elimination. With the creeping light that precedes dawn, fatigue fell upon the house as if from the rafters. Servants yawned behind their hands. Yarrow's men stamped to warm their feet. Miss Marsh did not stir. At 4:45, Dr. Remley arrived with a case of files and the anxious rectitude of the provincial physician. Holmes received him cordially, praised his restraint in doing nothing rash, and led him away to the corridor with a caution so elaborate that I perceived he wished the doctor as far from the heart of the house as possible. When he returned, there was a hint of frost about his mouth that meant the decision had congealed out of vapor. Collect them, he said softly to me, all of them. Mr. Willoughby, Mrs. Dorrit, Hargreaves, the maids. Bring them to the library as the clock strikes 5. Inspector, if you please. Within 10 minutes we had convened the small tribunal. The fire was newly poked. The light fell across faces drawn and pale from want of sleep. Holmes stood by the desk with the authority of a magistrate and the ironic amusement of a dramatist who knows his third act. My friends, he said, we have had a visitation in the night. The serpent descended as predicted, but, finding itself anticipated, it did no harm. Inspector Yarrow has placed men at suitable points. They report that the apparatus above Miss Marsh's chamber has not been approached since our discovery. We must therefore suppose that the mind which commands it, having failed, now waits. I, too, have waited and watched. His gaze moved, light and unhurried, from face to face. Willoughby's eyes met his bravely, though the man's hand trembled upon the chair back. Mrs. Dorrit pressed her handkerchief. There was a faint, powdery bloom at the corner, almost invisible. The maids looked ready to faint. Hargreaves alone had the calm of stone. Holmes' next words were so quiet that we leaned forward without knowing it. "Mr. Hargreaves, will you step to the window if you please?" The butler obeyed. Holmes took his left hand not roughly, but with the respect of a physician and, with the smallest silver lens, examined the forefinger. There, plain enough to my eye, lay a shadow lodged in the crease, as if a bruise of soot had made its home. Holmes let the hand fall gently, and turned it so the palm faced up. In the hollow near the base of the thumb, in that valley where the tendons rise, I saw the palest tint no color, until the light caught it, then a breath of blue stirred the skin, and was gone. A slow breath moved through the room. Willoughby half rose. Mrs. Dorrit's lips parted. Hargreaves did not flinch. "Sir," he said very quietly, "you have been thorough." "I have been fortunate," Holmes corrected, equally quiet. The lamp-black was Inspector Yarrow's unknowing alaphor. The gong will tell tales to any who strike it, while the tint belongs to a humble paste of my own, brushed along a cord where a careful hand must pass. You tugged once for reassurance. You tugged again for murder. But murder, tonight, had a net for company. At last a flicker passed over the old retainer's mask, a passing cloud across a carved face. "I will not speak," he said. "You already have," Holmes returned, and his voice was neither triumphant nor cruel, only tired. "But I will not yet pry your motive loose in front of your master's house. For though your hand is the hand upon the cord, I am not yet certain it is the hand upon the purse. There is a brain here, Mr. Hargreaves, behind yours, or perhaps alongside it, clever enough to set you to labors that suit your virtues of loyalty and silence. A brain that will show itself when its tool is broken." He turned away. "Inspector, take Mr. Hargreaves quietly to a room where he may sit. Permit no one to speak with him. Mr. Willoughby, I beg you to remain. Mrs. Dorrit, you will be so kind as to fetch from your press the bottle of attar you prize. Bring it to me here." The housekeeper bristled, then bobbed, then departed. Hargreaves went with Yarrow, composed as a bishop going to answer questions about his accounts. Willoughby seized Holmes' sleeve. "Hargreaves," he whispered hoarsely, "if he has done this thing, if he but why? For heaven's sake." Holmes looked down at the hand on his arm. His eyes were very gentle. "Because the world is complex, Mr. Willoughby, and there are debts that are not of money. Because men like Hargreaves are made of obedience, and an old obedience can be turned to a new master by means I have not yet completed measuring. Be patient with me a little longer. The serpent's head has shown itself. I would have the body as well." He laid his fingers over Willoughby's, firm and brief, then freed himself. "Watson," he said, in that brisk tone which always set my heart to the march, "we have work remaining. See that Dr. Remley visits Miss Marsh, as planned, and does only what any competent man would do. Nothing. Send a lad to the station master with my wire in reply, and keep an eye on the eastern hedge. There will be a visitor today who believes himself invisible. We shall make him visible by arranging that he discovers us where we should not be, and not where we are. In brief, he shall be out." "Out," I repeated. "Where in the name of common sense, Holmes?" He smiled, and the sardonic line about his mouth softened into something like play. "Under your window, with a shabby coat and a gardener's hat, my dear fellow. You shall mistake me for the beach. Others will do the same. If fortune favors us, by sunset we shall know not only how the serpent strikes, but who taught it the trick." And with that, as the clock upon the mantel chimed 5 in a voice as thin as paper, Holmes drew a folded bundle from the valise he had carried since London, a shapeless brown coat, a faded felt, and a pair of stained gloves, and, with a remarkable economy of gesture, became a different man entirely. Bent, slow, anonymous. "Holmes," I said involuntarily, "take care." His eyes met mine with their old, quick light. "Care is the one commodity of which I am never bankrupt," he returned. "Courage, Watson." Then, without another word, he slipped from the room, and the air about Greyhaven seemed to tighten once more, as if the house itself knew that a snare had been set inside a snare, and that the hunter had gone to lie where prey and danger walk in the same shadowed path. Chapter the 9th. The reveal the winter day had scarcely shaken off the dimness of dawn when the snare that Holmes had so carefully arranged began to tighten. The house, though outwardly unchanged, possessed an altered atmosphere, charged, expectant, as if every beam and banister waited for the denouement. The servants went about their duties under the watchful eye of Inspector Yarrow's men. Mrs. Dorrit moved like a shadow between the pantry and the parlor, and Mr. Willoughby spent the hours in restless pacing, now muttering to himself, now questioning Holmes in futile bursts, to which my friend responded with nothing but the most courteous silence. Holmes had disappeared shortly after our encounter in the library. Dressed in his gardener's disguise, he had slipped into the grounds with that uncanny capacity of his to make himself invisible in plain sight. When I passed the breakfast-room window, I caught a glimpse of a bent figure pruning shrubs beneath the eastern hedge, its hat pulled low. Had I not known the truth, I should have taken him for some rustic laborer of the estate. The morning dragged on. Miss Marsh remained unconscious, though Dr. Remley reported a slight strengthening of her pulse. She's beginning to stir from the narcotic influence, he told me, but she will remember little, I fear. Perhaps, I replied carefully, that is just as well. It was close to noon when a curious incident occurred. One of Yarrow's constables, stationed at the eastern hedge, came hurriedly to the house with word that a figure had been seen approaching along the lane. A solitary man, in a heavy cloak, carrying a small leather vest. He had paused briefly at the gate, as if reconnoitering, then proceeded toward the servants' entrance with the air of one expectant. Inspector Yarrow looked at me. "One of your London friends?" he asked gruffly. "Hardly," I said. "Where is Holmes?" "Still lurking out there," the man replied. But this visitor doesn't seem the least surprised to find the place under watch. I accompanied Yarrow to the side door, where the stranger had just presented himself. He was of medium height, spare in build, with a dark, neatly trimmed beard and sharp eyes that flicked about the place like a bird's. His cloak, though travel-stained, was well cut. His boots, though muddy, were of expensive make. He removed his hat politely as we approached. "Good day," he said, in a low, well-modulated voice. "I am here to see Mr. Hargreaves." "Mr. Hargreaves," Yarrow returned evenly, "is not receiving visitors." The man's brows knit in feigned confusion. "Indeed? I was told he required my services. He sent word to London 3 days ago. And what services might those be?" I asked. The stranger hesitated, then smiled slightly. "My name is Felix Morton. I am an importer of rare animals and curiosities. Mr. Hargreaves engaged me to deliver a specimen, a rather singular serpent." Yarrow and I exchanged a glance. Morton went on, entirely unperturbed. "The delivery was made in due course, but he requested that I return for further payment. I assumed this was the purpose of the summons." "You carried the serpent?" I asked. "Yes. A preserved specimen from the East Indies. Quite harmless, I assure you. Though I must confess," he added with a wry smile, "the household seems rather in a state." Before I could answer, a voice spoke from behind him, mild but edged like a blade. "Indeed it is, Mr. Morton, and thanks to you, we are now in a position to set it to rights." The man spun round. Standing in the doorway, straight now and unmistakable in his bearing despite the gardener's hat and coat, was Sherlock Holmes. His gray eyes were all right, not with anger, but with the cold flame of complete understanding. "I fancy, Inspector," Holmes said, "that this is the missing piece of our puzzle." Morton's composure faltered for the first time. "I beg your pardon? You will have an opportunity to beg it properly in due course," Holmes replied. "For now, you will accompany us to the library." Within 10 minutes, the principals of the case were assembled once more before the library fire. Mr. Willoughby sat stiffly in an armchair, his hands gripping the arms as though the room itself were tilting. Mrs. Dorrit hovered near the door, her handkerchief fluttering like a nervous bird. Hargreaves, stern and silent, was brought in under guard and placed by the wall. Inspector Yarrow took up a position behind Morton, who stood composed once more, though a faint bead of perspiration gleamed at his temple. Holmes took his customary place by the hearth. The serpent device, secured beneath its glass dome, lay upon the table before him like some pale offering to reason. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Dorrit," he began in that measured voice which I had heard strike fear into murderers and calm into the frantic, "it is time to draw together the threads of this curious tapestry. We have before us a young lady rendered insensible without a mark upon her, a serpent of uncanny appearance, silk cords, floral powders, reversed knots, a missing servant, and a household in disarray. Scotland Yard might have called it the work of some Eastern cult, or of a supernatural visitation, but we, Watson, know better. I inclined my head. We do indeed. Holmes gestured toward the glass dome. The so-called Opal Serpent is nothing more than a clever contrivance of preserved carcass fitted with a glass ampoule, silk dispersal gauze, and a simple pulley mechanism. A tug from a hidden passage, a fall from the wardrobe cornice, and the room fills with a powder that induces unconsciousness. A reverse knot on a bell cord, a touch of midnight stagecraft, and an innocent victim sees only the serpent dropping from above. Morton shifted uneasily. Holmes's gaze pinned him like a specimen. The powder, Holmes continued, is a mixture of tuberose, benzoin, and ground glass. Inhaled in quantity, it acts as a narcotic. On a glass rim, it leaves crystalline traces. On a fender, it settles like frost. It arrived at Greyhaven concealed within a letter posted from Bond Street, a letter you, Mr. Morton, arranged to have sent. Morton's eyes widened, but Holmes did not pause. You, sir, supplied not only the serpent, but the very materials used to create this illusion. And you were paid to do so by the man who stood at the heart of this house. His gaze shifted to Hargreaves. For years, Holmes said softly, you have served this household with unblemished loyalty, but there are older loyalties still. You once served the late Mr. Marsh, did you not? And he, I understand, dismissed a certain unscrupulous cousin from the family circle many years ago. Hargreaves's lips thinned, but he said nothing. Holmes turned to Morton. You were the go-between. The cousin, now returned from abroad with ambition but without claim, required two things. Miss Marsh incapacitated and suspicion directed elsewhere. You provided the means. Hargreaves, under pressure of debt and misguided loyalty, provided the access. Mr. Willoughby leapt to his feet. Cousin? Who? Holmes's gaze turned upon him, sharp as a blade. Why, Mr. Felix Morton, of course. That is not your trade. Name it is your true one. Felix Morton Marsh, disinherited 30 years ago. The importer's license is genuine, but conveniently useful. A murmur rippled through the room. Morton went pale. Holmes continued, relentlessly now. You approached Hargreaves months ago, offering payment in exchange for his assistance. Perhaps you reminded him of some past kindness. Perhaps you threatened him with exposure for some old failing. In any case, he became your accomplice. The serpent was delivered, the mechanism prepared, the powder placed. At midnight, a tug upon the cord, a chime of the gong, and Miss Marsh falls into her engineered sleep. Your plan, Cousin Morton, was to return today, claim some contrived guardianship, and spirit her away or at least secure access to the estate. Carter the groom was either bribed to assist or used as a decoy. In either case, he is no longer at liberty. Morton found his voice at last. This is outrageous. You have no proof. Holmes raised his hand. On the contrary, I have the handkerchief from your attic shelf, bearing both powder and your initial. I have the postmark from Bond Street, and a handwriting sample on the customs declaration that matches the address on the letter. I have the pulley and silk cords you installed, and the mark of my own aniline paste on Hargreaves's hand from last night. I have the serpent itself, intact, with the ampoule unbroken thanks to our intervention. And, most telling of all, I have the testimony of your supplier in London, who has already confirmed by wire that Felix Morton purchased such a serpent 6 weeks ago, giving Greyhaven Hall as the destination. Morton's defiance crumbled visibly. Yarrow stepped forward. The man made no resistance as the inspector's hand closed on his shoulder. Hargreaves, pale and upright, spoke for the first time. I did it for the family, he said quietly. For the name. He said he would restore what was lost. Holmes's voice softened. And so you bound yourself to a serpent's tail. That afternoon, Inspector Yarrow departed with Felix Morton in custody and 2 constables to track down the missing Carter, who was soon found unharmed but terrified in a nearby barn, where Morton had locked him after using his cart. Hargreaves, broken but dignified, surrendered himself to the law. Miss Marsh awoke that evening weak but safe, with no memory of the serpent's true nature. Holmes and I stood together on the frost-stiff lawn as the police carriage rumbled away down the lane. The pale sun was sinking behind the hedges, casting long shadows across Greyhaven. It was never truly the serpent, I said quietly. It was a man. It is always men, Holmes replied. The serpent is merely the shape they give their cunning. Chapter X. Aftermath at Baker Street. In the days that followed the unmasking of Felix Morton, whom Holmes, with that pitiless exactitude of his, had restored to his true surname. We remained at Greyhaven Hall to see the matter set upon a footing of order. The law, once roused and properly aimed, proves a steady creature. Inspector Yarrow, having secured both the principal actor and the instrument of his villainy, showed an honest eagerness to march under Holmes's conclusions, as though they were his own colors. Carter, the missing groom, was discovered before sundown in a loft behind a tenant's cottage, pale, muddied, and shaking with the aftersickness of fear. His tale how a stranger coaxed him to the lane with talk of wages and a groom's place in London, then clapped him by the shoulder with an iron grip and bundled him into the handcart with a warning to hold his tongue was as consistent as it was pitiable. When at last they brought Hargreaves from the little study where he had sat, silent and immovable, the old retainer let the lad pass with a glance that was neither forgiveness nor reproach, but the dull acknowledgment of one whose calculations have reached their end. Miss Eleanor Marsh, for her part, awoke toward evening with the gentle bewilderment of one who has traveled a great distance in sleep, and returned to find the furniture moved a few inches to the left. She looked upon me with a composure that quickly won my regard, asked in a whisper whether she had been long ill, and when told the truth in a cautious outline, set her hand lightly over mine, and thanked me with a gravity beyond her years. It was characteristic of Holmes that he would not let the fog from our powder drift back upon her memory. "No more serpents," he said curtly to me when I proposed a fuller account. "Let the mind close over that particular track. The best scar is the one that does not itch." By noon of the next day we were on the London train. The damp Surrey fields slid away. Chimney pots gathered like ranks of blackened soldiers, and soon we were once more among the familiar smoke and clangor of our native Babylon. The air of Baker Street, stale and companionable, received us as a hearth might receive returning wanderers. Mrs. Hudson, who had gleaned from the morning journals some sensational version of our doings, contrived a little feast of broiled cutlets and a pudding, and hovered in maternal disapproval of Holmes's avowed intention to sup upon coffee and tobacco alone. "You'll take a plate, Mr. Holmes," she insisted, with that immovable civility against which even his irony went blunt. Then half a plate, he yielded, which in Holmes's vocabulary signified 2 bites and a thought. When we had eaten sparingly, with the robust appetite of a man released from an anxious duty, we repaired to the sitting-room and drew our chairs closer to the fire. Outside, the fog had crept up again to rub its damp flank along the windows. Cabs slithered like black beetles over the wet street. The city hummed beneath the muffling veil. There were upon the table our old companions, the chemical stand with its stained test tubes, the violin in its case, 3 monographs on obscure branches of Chinese pottery, a recent enthusiasm of my friends, and a heap of newspapers in which some imaginative reporter had christened the business at Greyhaven as the curse of the Opal Serpent. Holmes took up the paper, glanced at the headline with a sort of wintry amusement, and dropped it again upon the pile. The curse, he remarked, lay, as such things generally do, in the credulity of those willing to be cursed. Men who do not examine fall beneath their own shadows. I stirred the embers. "You are unjust to yourself, Holmes. There was craft enough in Morton's contrivance to snare any but the very keenest eye." He made a little movement of the shoulder. "It is the eye that is paid, my dear Watson. When Providence turned a portion of mankind's vision outward, it made the rest of us necessary." We sat for a while without speaking. I had learned, over the years of our friendship, to respect those intervals when Holmes's mind, having harvested a field, threshes the grain in silence. Presently he drew up one long knee beneath his clasped hands, and regarded the fire with a look that mingled analysis with an odd, reluctant pity. "You will set it down?" he asked, as if the matter were of no consequence. "If you will permit it," I said. "The world will have the truth, and not the sporting journalist's inventions." He inclined his head. "It will do no harm. Only avoid the more theatrical aspects. The truth, properly presented, is sufficiently indecorous." "You mean to say," I ventured, smiling, "that I must leave out your transformation into a gardener, your ink that kisses the palm, and your soot that indicates the gong?" "Leave out nothing of method," he returned, "but spare the sentimental embellishment that turns villains into legends. Morton deserves the gallows prose, not a poet's line." "Will he hang?" I asked. Holmes's face became remote a granite cliff seen through Siamese. "He will answer for attempted murder, for conspiracy, and for unlawful confinement. The law will name the crime, but we have already named the man. As for Hargreaves, he stopped, and there was in his pause a rare hesitation. You pity him, I said. He shot me a glance whose impatience failed to quite hide a peculiar tenderness. I recognize him. The species, I mean. There are men born to obedience as others are born to music. Give such a man a master with a plausible grievance, and the voice to lay claim upon old loyalties, and you arm him with his own conscience. Hargreaves imagined he was setting the house to rights, restoring a balance overturned by a dead man's will. He forgot that law, like mathematics, is not ill used by the dead, but by the living. He will plead that he meant no lethal harm, I suggested, that the powder would keep Miss Marsh but a day in sleep, and had the ample fallen clean had my net not tempered the dose. The line between sleep and extinction is finer than silk. No, Watson, he trod, where only knowledge has the right to step, and without it he becomes as dangerous as any cutthroat with a cosh. He fell silent again, then added, almost to himself, and yet he brought the girl her broth for 2 winters when she had the influenza, and mended the governess's latch with his own hand. Men are continuous, not composed. It is the greatest difficulty of judgment. I confess the remark moved me. It is not often that my friend permits sympathy to outflank his austere intellect. I was about to say so when he leaned suddenly forward, the old keen light striking through. You asked me at Greyhaven what lay within the serpent, he said. I forbore to tell you the entire history, because it is a poor habit to parade a conjecture while it is still clothing itself. But the core of the trick is worth the record. There were in fact 2 ampoules. The first, that burst in our net, held the narcotic powder. The second he lifted his finger was concealed in the head behind the false valve. It carried a minute charge of camphor and spirit drawn through a perforation by the drop's impact, so that a faint breath should strike the victim's face a bite to persuade the imagination. It is the mind one must pierce, if one is to poison with theater. And the spheres you dislodged from the hinge? I asked. The little opaline seeds that fled with a hiss. A magician's flourish, he said. Compressed pellets of salts with a trace of aroma. Heated by the room, they softened and left that shimmering smear you observed upon the carpet. It is a habit of clever rogues to over-furnish their illusions. Had Morton trusted one device, the risk of discovery would have been less. You mean, I said, smiling, that conceit betrayed him. Conceit, Holmes replied dryly, is a species of light by which a fool reads his own sentence. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram upon a tray. Holmes broke it open. His mouth twitched as he read. Yarrow reports, he said, passing the slip to me. Morton has confessed to the Bond Street purchase and to his hand in the installation, though he blames continental practices for the suggestion and claims that he meant only to secure temporary control of Greyhaven until legal instruments could be altered in his favor. The jury will appreciate the distinction, he added, with a frigid humor that left no doubt of his opinion. Hargreaves, for his part, has made a full accounting. There is always one who confesses in speech, and one who confesses in silence. I laid the paper down. And Miss Marsh? A second wire from Dr. Remley. She has taken broth and is sleeping without narcotics. No fever. He is a sensible man, and will be wiser for his ignorance. He rose, crossed to the mantel, and adjusted the Persian slipper, wherein he kept his tobacco. It remains to keep an eye upon the solicitors for a time. Inheritances are hives where many kinds of bees make their home. Holmes, I said, you have not yet answered one question that nags me. How did Morton believe Hargreaves could be swayed? Holmes tamped the tobacco with a forefinger. Family whispers. Old grievances. A letter found its way to a loyal ear. Morton knew the one fact that mattered, that Hargreaves had served the late Mr. Marsh in his youth, and had seen that gentleman cut off a branch of the family tree. There are men whom such pruning offends like a physical pain, a prophecy, a coin, and a promise that was Morton's coinage. He paid with it until Hargreaves could no longer tell the difference between duty and indulgence. He struck a match. The flare lit his ascetic features, as if a sketch artist had found them anew. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the soft crackle of the coal and the gentle rasp of his breath as he drew upon the pipe. The room settled around us. The fog pressed its face to the window like a child. You see, Watson, he said at last, the oldest conjuring trick in England. Make a serpent out of silk and glass, and the Englishman, who prides himself upon seeing through a charlatan, will nevertheless leap from the chair. but put a plausible motive into a faithful servant's hand, and you may set him to pulling your wires while the room applauds his loyalty. The cruelty is that Hargreaves did not begin as a villain. He became one by practicing virtue at the wrong command. I gave no answer. Perhaps my silence encouraged in him a tone more reflective than usual, for he went on in a manner that was almost gentle. "You like to speak, in your chronicles, of justice," he said. "It is a word to handle carefully. The law will take Morton. It may yet temper its view of Hargreaves. That is not our concern. Our business is not to answer for heaven, but to set the floorboards true so. Men may walk without falling through. Miss Marsh will rise tomorrow and step upon a firm plank. That is enough." "It is not a little," I returned. He bowed his head, conceding the point. The evening gathered the glow from the fire, had that cozy force which makes a man unwilling to move, even to trim the lamp. Somewhere in the street below a newsboy cried, "Murder, mysterious serpent," with industrious woe. Holmes smiled, rose, and took the violin from its case. There are occasions when he uses the instrument as a scalpel for his own spirit. This was such a night. The first notes crept soft and cool into the room, then widened like lamplight over water. It was not one of his fiery flights, no Paganini, for conquest, but a grave air, simple and exact, with the pathos of a psalm. When he had finished, he laid the bow along the strings, and looked across at me with that sudden boyishness which, in him, could still occasionally break through the marble. "You are meditating on a title," he said. "Spare me Curse and Opal, if you can. I fear the newspapers have forestalled me." I laughed. "Besides, the public will have it Serpent." "Then give it the Serpent," he conceded, "provided you give it also the thread. Let them see the cord by which the thing was lowered. They may remember to look up the next time a monster falls from a cornice." He replaced the violin, and for a space we listened to the distant city and to the small living sounds of our rooms. I think both of us, in our different ways, were thinking of the faces at Greyhaven, of Willoughby's strained indignation when suspicion brushed him, of Mrs. Dorrit's fluttering piety, of Hargreaves's hands so firm and capable, and of a young woman with steady eyes who had not yet learned how close she had come to leaving the world she did not know she loved. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared with another telegram. Holmes glanced at it and passed it on with the indifference of a man whose mind has already leapt ahead. "For Mr. Willoughby," I read. "Miss Marsh is recovering rapidly. Send gratitude. Will call upon you when she is able. God bless you both." Holmes's mouth changed no smile, but the ghost of one. "There, Watson, a gentlemanly benediction to conclude our sermon. And you?" I asked. "What benediction will you take for yourself?" "The one I always do," he answered, stretching out his long legs and closing his eyes. "Work. Another case, another puzzle," he corrected. "The world, happily, has no end to them. Meanwhile," he opened one eye with insufferable languor, "you may pour the coffee you trumpeted to Mrs. Hudson, and which, if I do not drink, she will hold against me till spring." I complied. The coffee steamed between us, dark as the Thames at midnight and twice as bracing. Holmes accepted his cup, cradled it a moment in his long fingers, and then, with a half-turn toward the window, seemed to withdraw into that curious chamber of his mind where, I imagined, the case had already been lodged among its fellows, labeled, cross-referenced, and set within some private taxonomy, whose only categories were truth and error. I have seen him thus at the end of many investigations, self-effacing after triumph, slightly melancholy after battle, as though the victory had cost him some inner economy of energy that must be carefully restored. He spoke once more, so softly that I almost missed it over the hiss of the coal. "There is a particular virtue," he said, "in not mistaking the appearance of evil for its substance. One may smash the serpent and yet leave the cord that lowered it. Better to show the cord in daylight." Outside, the fog pressed on the lamps made little golden islands in the dark. Inside, in our snug room, the violin slept, the fire settled, and my friend cold, brilliant, sardonic, and at intervals, such as this, almost humane, drank his coffee and closed his eyes. I looked at him with that old familiar mixture of admiration and affection which has, I confess, made the chronicler at times a less exacting critic. Then I drew the writing board upon my knee and began, with such fidelity as I could manage, to set down the events of those strange days at Greyhaven, hoping that in the telling I might render, if not the full cunning of Holmes's art, at least the steady warmth of his purpose. Thus ended the affair of the Opal Serpent, at least in the public portion of it. There remained, as there always does, a penumbra of smaller consequences. Letters answered, statements signed, a grateful hamper returned from Surrey, and a note upon Holmes's desk, written in a clear, feminine hand, that I found some weeks later pressed between two monographs. It bore only these words: "For your kindness in proving that not all serpents strive to kill." I did not ask him who had sent it. I did not need to know. Holmes, for his part, tucked it without comment among the papers of a different case, and reached for his violin. And London vast, indifferent, inexhaustible rolled on beyond our window, its fogs and crimes ceaseless as the tide, while in our rooms on Baker Street the coal glowed, and the greatest and most singular of reasoners composed his mind for whatever next shadow might take the shape of peril, and whatever next coil, however cunningly wrought, might seek to descend upon unsuspecting sleep.